I am Tom Nelson, and I'm very happy to have Tony Heller here. Tony, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself to get us started?
I've been interested in weather and science and environmental issues my whole life. I testified at a congressional hearing in 1971 or 1972 in support of a wilderness area in Utah. And I was very active with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. And so I worked as a wilderness ranger a couple summers. And so I've been very interested in environmental stuff. I ride my bicycle everywhere. I do all my shopping on the bicycle. I'd be perfectly happy to see 90% of the cars off the road. But my motivation for doing all this climate stuff isn't that I love cars or I love fossil fuels or anything like that.
Right.
It's that I recognize that having an adequate supply of energy is very important. And just I love science. I've always loved science and weather. And it really annoys me, all the propaganda that's being generated in the name of science, which actually has nothing to do with science at all.
Okay, all right. And there was a time in the past when you did believe in a climate scam, right? You switched
Oh,
over. Yeah.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. In 1980, I was working at Los Alamos as a geochemist, and my boss introduced me to the concept of global warming, and it sounded pretty reasonable. You had more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is trapping heat and making it warmer. And from my observations, it certainly appeared to be true. I lived in England in the late 60s and early 1970s. And then in 1990s, I was traveling there a lot on business. And it was very clear that winters in England were much warmer in the 1990s than they were 30 years earlier.
Mhm.
I'd fly into Heathrow in February and the grass was green and there was people water skiing around 1998, that very warm year. And so it all seemed to make perfect sense to me. And around 2001, 2002, I was coaching kids soccer in Colorado, and we were having a terrible drought. And the city council, Longmont City Council, wanted to shut down the soccer fields. And so I went to the city council and gave this impassioned speech that with this global warming stuff, it's just going to get worse. This drought's just going
Okay.
to get worse. So please open up some fields for the kids to play. And they went for it. They believed my argument. And so I sort of added on, kids in Brazil play on dirt or cobblestones, and they have the best players in the world.
Mhm.
So our kids don't need perfect grass. So we went on that, and there's a lot of truth to it. We played for a couple of years on extremely dry, hard fields, and I know my skills improved tremendously because when you're playing on soft grass all the time, it's much easier. But when the ball's moving very quickly on hard ground, you have to be more skillful to control it. So I think it was really beneficial those couple of years.
Mhm.
But then things started to change for me. And in 2003, I was over in Cambridge, England, on a business trip. I was talking to some venture capitalists about an engineering idea I had, and I took a train into London, and it started snowing. And this was like 3 years after the Met Office had announced that snowfalls are now a thing of the past. And on the train, taking the train back out to Cambridge, we actually got stuck about a mile outside of the train station because there was so much snow. I started wondering, well, this isn't supposed to be happening. It's supposed to be getting hotter and less snow. And so that started me thinking. And then I came back to Colorado, and that April, in 2003, they had one of the largest snowfalls on record in Boulder, like up in the hills. They got like 6 feet of snow up above Boulder. And this really made me really wonder that, well, this is not supposed to be happening. Things are changing. It looks more like it's cyclical than rather it's some sort of linear trend towards climate doom and destruction.
Okay.
And then in 2006, I was working out in California. It was an extremely hot summer. Our pool in Cupertino got hot all the way down to the bottom of the pool. And we were driving. I started working for Intel up in Colorado. And I was driving back, and it was like 115 degrees in Sacramento. Got back to Fort Collins, Colorado. It was over 100 degrees several days in a row. I thought, yeah, this has got to be the end of the world. But then that fall, I was coaching kids soccer again, and it got really cool and rainy. It was raining every day and it was cold. And all of our soccer games that fall where it was cold and windy and snowy. And then we had Fort Collins had their largest snowfall on record at Christmas that year. And once again, it's like, what's going on? This doesn't make any sense. This is not a trend. This is something cyclical. So that was when I really started looking into it. And I was just absolutely horrified. And working as a scientist for decades and as an engineer, I was horrified. I started looking at how the data was being mishandled by government agencies, how conclusions were being drawn about climate that weren't appropriate for the data they claimed they were getting it from. I started realizing this wasn't a scientific discussion, it was something else going on. This was propaganda. So I started calling it a scam. I wrote my first articles about climate in 2008, and I was calling it a scam. And this made a lot of other climate skeptics angry. They were saying, no, these people are just mistaken. We can convince them with science. I said, no, you can't. They're not interested in science. They're doing propaganda. Mm-hmm. They know that what they're saying isn't true. And so I got a lot of resistance from the skeptic community for a long time about that. But I think most people have come around to recognize this never had anything to do with science. There was always an agenda related to energy. By demonizing fossil fuels, they could get control of the energy supply, which is what we're seeing now. You know, in Europe, particularly, they've got these horrible disasters where they don't have enough energy. The government have been implementing this green energy nonsense for years, and now they don't have enough energy as a result because they were relying on things which there was never any possibility would be reliable. The wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time. And you can't run our society and civilizations need 24/7 energy. You can't shut down hospital operating rooms or banks or computer networks or the internet or phone systems because the wind's not blowing that week. It doesn't work that way. And it was obvious that this was always the case, but for some reason, governments have been following down this path, which no serious scientist or engineer ever would have told them was a sensible thing to do.
Okay. Do you think, in your experience, that there's a lot more well-informed climate skeptics out there now than there was when you started in 2008? Because I started kind of the same time, and that's the impression I'm getting.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. I'm pretty isolated. I'm off in my own world here, but I get a lot of comments on YouTube from people saying that we're making a difference, that the word's getting out, so I hear that a lot from people, so I'll trust their judgment on it. I don't have any personal experience to make me believe that, but based on what other people are telling me, it could well be true. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm very active on Twitter, and I had been having these Twitter spaces every Wednesday. But anyway, your name comes up all the time. And the consistent message is that you're just killing it on YouTube. You have 117,000 subscribers and all those views and tons of comments, right? Your comment section is just full. So what is your secret to so much success on YouTube?
Well, during the 1980s, for a few years, I worked as a high school teacher, teaching science. High school kids. A lot of kids had learning disabilities. I was teaching to. It was basically for rich kids from California who the California schools were paying to keep out of their systems. They were sending them off to this expensive private school near Sedona, Arizona, where I was teaching. And so I learned how to explain things very clearly and simply in a way which anyone can understand. And I never liked studying geology in college. I never liked it. That I always appreciated teachers who would explain things in simple form rather than trying to make themselves sound knowledgeable by using a lot of jargon, which is hard to follow, or trying to make it sound like they're very sciencey. It's usually the best scientists are people who can just explain things in simple terms, which anybody can understand. So that's what I do. So I explain things at a very logical level, avoiding technical terms. And I use a lot of historical references, newspaper articles showing how claims that are being made of unprecedented weather are simply not true. And claims about all this nonsense about Exxon knew in the 1970s and then covering it up, showing how that's just complete nonsense too. So there's a lot of value in just historical stuff, and but I enjoy explaining things and try to do it as simply as possible. I've made thousands of videos. At this point, I know what works, and I know what people respond to, and I know what they don't respond to. So it's pretty easy for me.
Okay. I think the people fudging the data, they hate those old newspaper reports because they can't fudge them. I think that's a big deal that you constantly are pointing out all the reporting from 1917, for example, about how horrible the weather was. I think it's great that you're doing that.
Yeah.
How are you finding that data?
I've got a number of different tools. There's a couple of newspaper archive sites, which I subscribe to,
Okay.
newspapers.com, and another one I just started subscribing to. I don't remember what
Okay.
it's called, but they have digitally searchable archives going back for hundreds of years. So you can just type in terms I want to search for, a date range, a state that I want to search in, various, a specific newspaper. Yeah, I've also got subscription to the New York Times archives. Australia has a great set of newspaper archives. New Zealand has a pretty good set. Some other countries do. And there's some academic archives as well, which I use. So it's pretty easy to get information. It's not like the old days where people had to go read through microfiche at the library. Everything's digital now. So it's very easy to dig this stuff up.
Okay. And what software are you using to create the videos? I'm just curious.
I use Filmora for my sort of talking videos, and I use Adobe Premiere Pro for my music videos.
Oh, okay. And mostly you're getting the word out through YouTube or through Gab. You're active on Gab too, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty much given up on that type of social media.
Okay.
Because for one thing, my messages are generally too long. Another thing is, since I liked Twitter because they had archives you could download. So I could put information on Twitter and then digitally search later and find. So it was a good way for me to archive information. But Gab, that doesn't seem to work on Gab for some reason. So the only thing I've been using Gab for recently is just for posting videos. Another thing is that I always found it very disturbing reading through the news on Twitter and Gab. It's stuff I just don't want to see. I want to just go about doing my thing, enjoy life, and not have to hear people on the left on Twitter talking about global warming and Donald Trump are going to end the world. And then people on the right on Gab say how Joe Biden's going to end the world and George Soros. Yeah, I don't want to see either of those things. So I just kind of like to just focus on my own stuff. And I'm extremely busy. I'm doing a number of engineering contracts and doing all the climate stuff. And we got 2 new puppies and do a lot of talk radio and podcasts. So I'm lucky if I get 5 hours of sleep at night.
Really, that is amazing that you're so productive. So on a typical day when you're doing your climate skeptic stuff, you're starting with Google News to see what people are talking about. Is that a starting point, or
I do that. That's a good place for it. Google News is an incredible source of propaganda.
Yes.
For identifying propaganda instantly. So I really appreciate them doing that.
So it seems like you're finding whatever the big propaganda news is of the day, and then you're producing maybe a video that's 5 minutes long saying here's why it's wrong.
Yeah. So we could just go through some today's global warming news on Google. They still use global warming. It seems to be interchangeable with climate change. You could probably type fossil fuels in and get the same thing.
Yeah, we can check on that. Do you even look at Twitter or anything else? Social media, you don't even look at it?
People send me Twitter stuff, so I'll look at it then. But generally, no, I won't look at Twitter because their goal is to make people crazy, and I don't have any interest in letting them do that.
Okay, all right. So if you have some Google News stuff to show us here, do you want to screen share it all?
So this is global warming news on Google this morning. So here the first story is great. Lee Dixon appears to doubt global warming during Arsenal commentary.
Saw that.
So why are they talking about global warming during a soccer match? Is the first that doesn't seem very appropriate. And then the language here, you could interchange that to Galileo appears to doubt geocentrism, or Or in the 19th century, it could have been such and so appears to doubt the gospel of such and such, some religion. So this is a religious thing. He's allowed to have his own opinion, but he's a heretic. He's doubting the global warming religion, and this makes him a heretic.
Yeah, it
And
seems like
yeah,
we're supposed to gasp and grab our pearls if we find out that somebody cast any doubt on the global warming narrative. It's just they're just horrified that he would
yeah,
doubt it. Yeah.
yeah. I used to watch sports all the time, but I can't stand it anymore because it's become so politicized. What does global warming have to do with soccer, with the English soccer leagues? It's ridiculous. So yeah, that's a good form of propaganda, the sort of intimidation, trying to intimidate people into compliance with this belief system, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So the next article is from NPR. Heat waves, wildfires, and floods, how climate change affects mental health. So the implication here is that heat waves, wildfires, and floods are something new, right? The implication is that they're caused by climate change, meaning that they didn't used to happen in the past. So that's why history is critically important. They're trying to propagandize people into believing that bad weather is something new. And so for young people who've never been taught history, this is very believable, right? They say, oh, wow, we didn't used to get hurricanes. We didn't used to get wildfires. We didn't used to get floods. So obviously this is caused by climate change, which means it's caused by the burning of fossil fuels. So the purpose is to create a panic, make people believe that if we don't stop using fossil fuels, then everybody's going to die. The world's going to burn up and we're all going to die a horrible biblical flood, fire, famine, pestilence, death, right?
Right.
And it's very effective because in the absence of people knowing history, how would they know the difference? How do they know they're not telling the truth? So that's why history is such a big part of what I do. I need, in order to get people to understand that this thing's a scam, they have to understand that these things have been occurring forever and they're not something new.
Yeah, I think your videos are doing a fabulous job of getting that word out, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Yeah,
Appreciate
yeah.
it. Then the next one, Kim Kardashian says she's realistic about climate change. You have to pick and choose. So there's a lot of interesting implications here. One is what do you mean pick and choose? The implication there is that you control the climate, that your decisions. If you buy a gas powered vehicle, you're going to cause millions of people to die in Pakistan from some hurricane or typhoon or something, right? So that's an interesting aspect of the propaganda, making people feel guilty, making people believe that they control the climate and their opinion about it is important, which is utterly ridiculous. And then the other aspect of this is Kim Kardashian, daughter of 1970s Olympic champion who had his picture on the cover of Wheaties. But what climate expertise does she have? People, I'm often, there's always attempts to discredit me based on the fact that I don't have a climate science degree from a university. And so I can't be quoted. But people like Kim Kardashian or Greta Thunberg they're considered experts, or Joe Biden, people who know nothing about climate or science at all. The press will quote them because they're presenting the message which the press wants to hear. They're purveyors of the propaganda, which the orthodoxy wants to hear. So there's a lot of interesting propaganda techniques indicated in that article. But the Independent was the newspaper which said in the year 2000 that snowfalls are now a thing of the past too. Okay, here's next one. The New York Times. Climate change is ravaging the Colorado River. There's a model to avert the worst. Well, if you look at what's actually ravaging the Colorado River, it has nothing to do with climate change. Well, a lot of the problem is the use of biofuel. Huge amounts of water are extracted from the Colorado River on the western side of the Continental Divide, brought through tunnels to the Colorado Front Range, where I lived for 25 years, and used to grow corn, which is then used to make ethanol for gasoline. So they're extracting something like 15 to 20% of Colorado River water to grow corn, a lot of which goes to make biofuels. So, and that's supposed to solve the climate issue. So that's one huge problem. Another big problem is Lake Powell itself. Lake Powell is has huge amount of surface area. It's out in the desert. They have very low humidities. It's hot there. And between 5 and 10% of all water in the Colorado River gets evaporated off the surface of Lake Powell. And Lake Powell was an environmental disaster to begin with. They flooded the most beautiful river, the most beautiful canyon on the Colorado River, which is Glen Canyon, to build it. So I personally am thrilled about the fact that Lake Powell is drying up. I hope it dries up completely. So they keep saying it's a bad thing having it dry up, but actually there would be more water in the Colorado River if Lake Powell didn't exist. Another big problem is that they're extracting huge amounts of water from the Colorado River and bringing it to Arizona, central Arizona and southern Arizona through the Central Arizona Project. So a lot of water is being extracted to bring water to the Front Range. A lot of water is being extracted to bring water to Phoenix and agricultural areas of Arizona. So it's not climate change that's ravaging the river. It's stupidity by humans that's doing it. If people didn't live here and the water was just left in the river channel, there would be lots more water in the Colorado River. But a lot of these things that are being done are specifically in the name of climate change, like the biofuels. So it's actually the climate scam that's ravaging the Colorado River rather than this imaginary climate change.
What do you think would happen to the Colorado River if we got 1 degree centigrade of global cooling? I don't know the answer to that. If they want to go back to the global average temperature of 1850, let's say, what would happen to precipitation?
Well, I think probably the driest year in the West was 1976 into 1977 during near the peak of the global cooling scare. It was President Ford went to Vail to go skiing at Christmas and there was no snow. Governor Brown in California declared a drought emergency of immeasurable magnitude. There was a huge forest fire near Los Alamos, New Mexico, where I was living at the time and where I grew up in June 1977. So yeah, there's lots of evidence that cooler periods produce worse droughts. The worst droughts in history in North America and in Europe all occurred during the 16th century, or the coldest years of the Little Ice Age. The Pilgrims and the Jamestown colonists were nearly wiped out by drought in the early 16th century. There was a worldwide drought in 1540, which was the worst drought on record in Europe and probably also their worst heat wave. And in North America, there was a terrible drought as well. The Native Americans living along the Mississippi River appealed to the Spanish explorer De Soto to pray to their God to save them from this horrible drought. So yeah, there's plenty of evidence that the worst droughts occur during colder periods, and warmer periods, which are normally associated with El Niños, bring lots more water to the west. So the story is actually exactly backwards. We've had an El Nino for the last 2 winters, and that's why it's been really dry in parts of the West. The West suffered several multi-century droughts from about 1800 into the 13th century. And the pinnacle of the Anasazi civilization, which dominated the Southwest for much longer than the United States has been around, was at Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. And they finally gave up after 70 years of drought in the 13th century. There was lots of evidence of cannibalism around that time. They couldn't grow crops anymore, so they started eating each other. Same thing at Mesa Verde in Colorado, Bandelier in New Mexico. The Anasazi just disappeared over a period of about 20 years because of drought.
Okay.
And I don't think that implementing a carbon tax or mandating electric vehicles would have done them any good.
Some of those ancient civilizations did think that some sort of human sacrifice would prevent bad weather, right? I don't know if they did, but maybe down in Mexico, or I know witches were burnt in Europe because of bad weather partially.
Yeah, certainly in Central America, the Mayans and the Aztecs, that was their response to drought, was to start sacrificing people. And then when the drought ended, they knew that they had sacrificed the right amount of people. So like you mentioned, that was similar to what was going on in Europe. burning witches for cooking the weather.
Yeah.
It was always someone has everything's there's this belief, that narcissistic belief that everything's controlled by humans.
Mhm.
The humans are the center of the universe, so anything bad that's going on has to be our fault. This is true in the Bible too, right? That Noah's flood was a response to human sin. So climate alarmists have picked up on that same concept, that man's carbon sins are causing bad weather.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of parallels between standard religion and the climate cult. I've seen people write articles about that. Buying carbon offsets is an indulgence, that type of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great stuff. I mean, there's parallels to religion all through this. Okay, next article is, will the summer of 2022 hasten France's efforts to fight climate change? So once again, there's the implication that individuals or countries or governments can control the climate, that policies by governments can prevent droughts or typhoons or hurricanes or heat waves, which is in itself absurd. There's no evidence to support that. But the other half of the propaganda here is that it's been hot and dry in France this summer, and that it must be something new. It must not have happened in the past, and it's an indication of climate change. But if you look through the historical record, France has had many very severe droughts and heat waves for records going back for at least 1,500 years. So there's nothing new about this. During the summer of 1911, 40,000 people in Paris alone died from the heat. So once again, there's multiple levels of propaganda. So I find articles like that very interesting. They're pushing people towards believing multiple different things, none of which have any basis in reality.
Have you had any success talking to mainstream journalists and pointing out that the weather was so bad in the past? And have you been able to break through at all in their thinking so that they don't just think that bad weather is evidence that CO2 causes bad weather?
Well, I know that people at the New York Times read and myself and watch my videos, and I know people at other alarmist websites do as well. They would never acknowledge that what I'm saying may be true. But at the same time, it's like in Star Trek, the Borg. I'm introducing disruptive thoughts. They're seeing my stuff, and it's got to weaken their resolve. It's got to make them realize, look, I'm just promoting a scam, and it's got to make them less enthusiastic about what they're doing. Because if they see my stuff consistently, they know that what they're saying isn't true, and they know that they're pushing a scam. And that's a very different emotional state to be in than believing you're saving the planet. If at some level they understand that they're just doing this for themselves, that this is a selfish thing, that it's an agenda, and that they're not actually saving the planet, that puts them in a very different mindset.
There was just this thing in the British media in the last month or so when they were frustrated and saying you should not listen to Tony from YouTube. I think that's what they said.
Yeah.
That must have been fun for you.
Yeah, BBC. Yes. So, I don't get a huge amount of views on my videos, largely because YouTube's doing a number of dirty tricks to suppress. Like, they don't inform most of my subscribers when I make a video. But at the same time, I think I'm reaching a lot of important people, which is the key thing.
Yeah, you have 40 million total views, right? 43 million or something. I just checked this morning, I think, on your channel. Whatever it is, it's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a few.
Okay, good.
I live in a state with 600,000 people. So I guess that's pretty good.
Yeah, you're in Wyoming? Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Okay. I did have a couple questions here I could throw in that
sure, anytime
readers came in. Let's see. The first one was, can you ask Tony about the surface mass balance in Greenland? Alarmists say Tony is not taking calving into consideration. Do you have anything to add about that, about what's happening with the surface mass balance?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the surface mass balance is the difference between the amount of snow which falls on Greenland's surface and the amount of melt which occurs there. And every year, Greenland gets a lot more snow falls on Greenland than melts. And in order to maintain equilibrium, something has to change, although the snow can't just pile up all the way to the top of the atmosphere. So what happens is the snow compacts, forms glaciers, which are then carried down by gravity down to the ocean, where they discharge, form icebergs, and wreck the Titanic. And So this is something, so huge amounts of excess snow builds up in Greenland every year, and this results in a large amount of glacial calving at the oceans. And then climate alarmists film a glacier calving and say, this is evidence of climate change, when all it is just evidence of a healthy glacier. So measuring the amount of ice loss from glaciers is very difficult. And so what they've done traditionally is use these gravitational anomalies from from satellites, the GRACE program run out of the University of Texas. And this is a really horrible, they claim that they can do things with it, which they can't. They can accurately measure the changes in gravity over a region, but they can't measure the changes in ice. And the reason is because ice is fairly low density, and it's only got 1/3 the density of rocks, and the ice sheets are only 2 miles thick, whereas the rocks underneath them are much, much thicker. And the crust of the earth is like 7 miles thick, and the mantle below it is very thick. We don't have any idea what's going on with the rocks underneath. Changes to the rock structure underneath are going to have a much larger effect on the gravity anomaly than any changes to the snow. So they have to come up with some sort of model about what's going on underneath the earth. And in fact, they state on the Danish Meteorological Institute website that they don't even make any attempt that the global isostatic adjustment isn't even used in their GRACE measurements. So it's just fake. There's a lot of changes since the end of the ice age. Glaciers have been melting. This is causing isostatic rebound. So they really don't have any idea that the gravitational anomalies are farce. An academic can come up with any numbers they want by making assumptions about what's going on with the rocks underneath the ice. So that the GRACE numbers are fake, and there's been times they even admitted that they had the numbers completely wrong. But they said, but now we're doing it right. The other thing is that what glacial loss of glaciers to calving has very little or nothing to do with the current climate. It has more to do with the amount of snow, which was falling sometime in the past, maybe decades ago, maybe centuries ago. It takes a long time for snow that falls to flow down to the ocean. So the only real measurement we have of the current climate of Greenland is the surface mass balance. So they keep saying, we have these numbers about glacial calving, but we don't really. Those numbers are just arm waving, and they're not really relevant to the current climate anyway.
But sometimes in the summer, don't they make a huge deal out of it on just a day-to-day change? That there's a big change in it from one day to the day before?
Well, if they have a warm day in Greenland in July, a lot of snow is going to melt. Greenland's a very large island. It's covered with snow. If they have a warm day, they're going to get a lot of melt. Maybe several inches of snow will melt off the surface in some place, the lower elevations. This is going to generate a lot of water. Then they go and film the water flowing over the surface, and they say Greenland is melting down. You know what? Just last week, over a 5-day period last week, during summer, Greenland got 18 billion tons of new snow. But if they lose 5 billion tons in one day in the summer, so Greenland lost 5 billion tons of ice in one day, right? Even though they can gain that much back in a few hours during the snow season.
Very interesting. I have one more question here. The reader said, I'm also interested in how temperature data has been manipulated and how we should be relying on the network of rural stations to compensate for the urban heat island effect.
Well, yeah, I think the urban heat island effect is somewhat relevant. Generally, in the United States, the United States Historical Climatology Network, the stations are generally fairly well sited. And I don't think that's the big issue. I think the big issue is the manipulation of the data by NOAA after the data is collected, because I use their raw data, their raw daily temperature data, and it seems to be pretty consistent. It seems to give believable answers, but they don't release graphs of that data to the public. They do massive adjustments to the data before they create their graphs. So the graphs we see about U.S. temperature graphs are completely fake. They show warming, which doesn't exist. And particularly interesting is looking at, rather than the average temperatures, is looking at the frequency of hot days. They show that there's been a huge decrease in the frequency of hot afternoons in the United States. the last 60 years, hot afternoons have been much less common than they were in the 60 years prior to that. And you can even find places on obscure websites, NOAA websites, showing this. And in the National Climate Assessment, they showed this, that heat waves were much worse in the United States prior to 1960. And as far as the global temperature goes, most of the Earth doesn't have suitable coverage to actually make a meaningful graph about the global temperature. They're just basically making stuff up. And the fact that all these different agencies show very similar graphs shows that they're colluding and basically committing fraud because the data isn't available to generate. The error bars should be huge. So we should see, if these different government agencies were working independently, we would see very large variations in the global temperature graphs, which we don't see.
A couple other questions. One is, how confident are you that more than half of the warming since 1975 was caused by humans?
Oh, it certainly was, but it's not caused by it's not caused by carbon dioxide. It's caused by data tampering by government agencies. So,
okay.
yes, certainly that's a human caused effect. So if you look at the satellite temperatures, like from UA, they show much less warming than since the 1970s than the surface temperatures does. And that's because people working at NASA and NOAA and some other government agencies are creating fake temperature graphs. Okay. And so that's human caused, definitely.
And you agree that the UAH satellite data, that's the best data we have coming from the 1970s to now? Is there any other data set that you like starting in 1979 to now?
Yeah, well, I like their stuff. I mean, obviously they've made adjustments too. And anytime people are making adjustments, you have to call into question whether they're doing it right. So, Roy Spencer and John Christie are making assumptions, and I think they're doing the best they can. I'm not convinced there's actually been as much warming as they say there has.
Okay.
But as far as commonly used graphs, they're definitely the best at this point. The graph from remote sensing systems was really good until 5 years ago when they corrupted it to make it conform more closer to the surface temperature record.
Okay.
So I used to use them a lot. Ted Cruz in a 2007 hearing or 2006 hearing used a graph from remote sensing systems. And after that, Carl Mears came under, at RSS, came under a huge amount of pressure to not let his stuff be used by evil Republican climate deniers anymore. So he adjusted the data, and it was funny how he did it. What he did was he just moved everything up to the high end of his error bar and declared he declared that the high end of his error bar was the new normal.
Really?
And I've shown this a few times. Now, if you take his pre-adjustment graph and plot it on at the same time as his post-adjustment graph, you see that's all that he did. He just said, forget the error bar. I'm just going to use the high ends and get these people off my back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, next question is, what is your best estimate for what the climate sensitivity is to doubled CO2? What do you think?
Pretty close to nothing.
Okay.
I did a contract for the National Center for Atmospheric Research back in 2009. They wanted me to accelerate their radiative transfer model. They wanted me to port it to a graphics processor. And so I learned how to use it and realized this is the model which is used in NCAR's weather and climate models. And I realized that it really increased carbon dioxide does almost nothing in an atmosphere where there's a lot of water vapor, which most of the Earth has. Carbon dioxide may be more relevant at the South Pole where there's very little water vapor, but in the mid-latitudes where we live, there's no reason to believe that increased carbon dioxide will have any meaningful impact on the temperature.
Okay, very interesting. Do you have any thoughts on what might happen between now and 2050 or 2100 in terms of global average temperature?
No, it's controlled by factors which we don't understand, we can't model. If you look at weather model, I look every day at weather models, general GFS weather models. If you look at their model for a week out, it changes radically from day to day and sometimes from over a period of a few hours. So they can't even predict weather patterns a week from now accurately, much less in 100 years.
Okay.
It's controlled by ocean circulation patterns and things outside of outside of our planet and outside of our solar system,
Mhm.
which we don't understand and don't have any control over and can't predict. The orbit of the Earth has a huge influence. And that's why we have these changes, alternating ice ages and warm periods.
Okay.
It's probably due to orbital variations of the Earth as well as variations in the Earth's axis and rotation. And these are much larger changes than anything we've experienced.
Okay. Do you have any scientists that you like to follow in terms of their work on trying to understand natural variability, like solar influences, anything like that?
Yeah, well, certainly Dr. Bill Gray, who passed away in 2016, he lived in Fort Collins, Colorado, where I used to live. We were very good friends. I go visit Bill all the time. He's a very generous person who'd spend hours and hours with me explaining to me tropical meteorology and how hurricanes and tropical storms and cumulonimbus clouds control the Earth's temperature by bringing warm, moist air from the surface up to the top of the atmosphere where they radiate off, where they condense. Moisture radiate off heat and then bring cool water back to the ground to keep the Earth's temperature moderated. He was certainly probably the biggest influence in my thinking about this. Dr. Tim Ball from Canada, who unfortunately is extremely sick right now
Oh no.
and probably won't be around too much longer, he's been a tremendous influence as well. We did a speaking tour in Australia around the time of the 2016 election, had tremendous fun doing that.
Okay. All right. Do you plan to go to the Heartland Conference in February in Orlando by any chance?
No, I haven't been to the last conference I went to. There was 2014. I
Okay.
like just being in Wyoming and keeping to myself, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
Taking the dogs hiking.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of good videos of the dogs playing around and stuff. Looks like a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, we got 2 new puppies. They're a blast.
Fantastic. Another question is, what tips do you have for the rest of us? Any good tips for spreading climate skepticism? You talked about some already about historical data. Anything else that we should be emphasizing more than we are, do you think?
Historical data is really the key to it. Like I said, young people, they're being told that we didn't used to get hurricanes, we didn't used to get tornadoes or floods, typhoons, and they don't have any way of knowing that that isn't true because schools don't teach history anymore, or they don't teach any real history. The kids don't. When I was in high school, Grapes of Wrath was mandatory reading. Steinbeck's accounts of the Dust Bowl. They don't do that anymore. If they just read that one book, they would know that this has all happened in the past. So it's very easy for them to propagandize young people. So the more information we can get to young people, in particular about history, I think that's really the key thing. And I used to teach school. I would love to get into some sort of gig where I can go around educating young people about history. That would be great for me. And when I lived in England, when I was a kid, I just loved history. I collected ancient English coins and ancient Roman coins. And in the late 1960s, you could still get pennies from Queen Victoria in your change. So it was a great place for that. And I love teaching history to children and adults, and that's one of my greatest joys in life.
Okay, so you are giving some live presentations, or maybe as COVID lightens up, you'll be out more talking in schools. Do you do that at all, or at libraries?
Schools won't.
Yeah. Okay.
They won't. I'm verboten in public schools, obviously.
Okay.
But next summer, I'm planning on giving a talk at Chautauqua in New York, I think.
Okay.
Probably be giving a talk at some big engineering conference in Denver. Sometimes I give talks to the Boulder libertarians.
Okay.
So yeah, I get out once in a while. I was supposed to do a speaking tour in Australia during summer of 2020 with Senator Malcolm Roberts, Peter Ridd, but unfortunately the Australian government shut down the borders to any evil people from out of country who might bring in horrible viruses to them. So I wasn't allowed didn't.
Okay.
And then I was going to go do some stuff in England and couldn't do it for the same reason there. So I haven't actually, I used to be on a plane like every 2 or 3 weeks. I haven't been on a plane since I flew back from Costa Rica at the beginning of March 2020.
Okay.
My last chance at a sane world. I'm not wearing a mask. I'm not dealing with all this insanity. So I haven't
Okay.
been on a plane for 2.5 years.
Okay. But you did do a speaking tour in Australia back before COVID, and that did you have a chance to speak in many different places there and spread the word?
Well, yeah, I gave presentations. Tim Ball and I gave presentations in Sydney and Canberra.
Okay.
And I think Tim went down and gave a presentation in Melbourne as well. The trip we had planned, the tour we had planned in 2020 was going to be much larger. We were going to cover much of the country, but unfortunately that got shut
Okay.
down.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think probably the main message that I'd want to share with people is don't let them set the agenda,
Okay.
right? I intentionally avoid social media, and I haven't had a television for 30 years.
Okay.
I don't read newspapers. The only reason I go to Google News just to find climate comedy, which I can write about, like these articles, but they'll drive you insane. H.L. Mencken said, a newspaper is a device for making the ignorant more ignorant and the crazy crazier. And that's absolutely true. They're not there to educate and inform. They're there to make people crazy. And people get addicted to the craziness. They keep coming back for it. And I remember when I lived in Boulder, which is naturally is one of the nicest places in the world. But the people there they have this crazy left-wing Democrat population. The people there are depressed and angry and upset all the time because they let themselves be bombarded with this propaganda. Whereas if they just tuned it out, they would be fine. So don't let them set the agenda. Don't let them control your psychological state. I avoid social media other than my own stuff. I completely avoid television. I avoid newspapers except for getting crazy articles like these ones. And if you do that, over a period of decades, you can clear your head out and understand what's really going on and view how there's this massive propaganda campaign being pushed to drive people crazy and to make people submissive and crazy like this. Well, the summer of 2022 hastened France's efforts to fight climate change. Well, that's absurd. France doesn't control the climate. There's nothing they can do about it. And the weather they're having is weather which has been experienced all the time in the past. So what they're trying to do is trying to make people feel crazy and guilty and upset and scared and nervous, none of which is appropriate. So don't let them do that to you. They're trying to ruin your life, and we have to take control and make sure it doesn't happen.
Interesting. So because you've tuned out all this stuff, this gives you a lot more time to get outside and go hiking, it seems like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
I would, when I quit watching television news 30 years ago, I was pretty crazy myself. I'd get really angry and say, why don't they say the other half of the story? Why is everything so one-sided? When are they going to tell the truth? I get really angry about it. And then finally I realized, well, they're not going to. These people are doing propaganda, not news. So I said, why am I letting them make me crazy? I'm just going to go hiking with the dogs. And so that's what I do now. I go hiking with the dogs.
Fantastic.
Been doing that for decades.
That's great advice. Okay. All right. Anything else you'd like to share?
No, that's about it. I enjoyed talking with you, Tom, and it's really good to meet you finally after all these years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally enjoyed it. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope to have you back again sometime if you happen to have any time in the future.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you next time.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.